My father threw away my vitamins, banned pillows, and made me wear a 60-pound vest, all to keep me marriage height. When I begged him to let me grow, he held up a saw and said, "Daddy knows how to fix things himself." I just backed away slowly. That was 14 months ago. Last night, he was dragged from a courthouse screaming, 5'4" was perfect. When I hit 5'4", my father declared I was done growing because that was the perfect height for a woman, and anything taller would ruin my life. Dad was a failed architect who spent years creating theories about human proportions and female marriageability. He believed women over 5'4" had exponentially higher divorce rates and lower happiness scores based on data he'd collected from dating websites and celebrity measurements. He covered our walls with charts showing the correlation between height and misery in women. According to his research, I had reached the exact height where I'd maximize my chances of finding a husband and minimize my chances of dying alone. The problem was, I had just turned 14 and nowhere near done growing. Dad measured me obsessively throughout my childhood and kept detailed logs of every inch. He'd make me stand against the kitchen wall every Sunday while he marked my height and calculated my growth rate. When I passed 5'2", he started getting nervous and researching ways to slow down growth. By 5'3", he was leaving articles on my bed about the health benefits of coffee for teenagers and the way malnutrition kept women petite in developing countries. But when I hit 5'4", he completely panicked. He threw away all my vitamins and started monitoring my food intake to make sure I wasn't getting too many nutrients. He said 1 more inch would push me into the danger zone where men would feel emasculated and I'd never find love. His methods started small but escalated quickly when I kept growing. First, he made me sleep without a pillow because he thought lying flat would keep me compressed. Then he started waking me up throughout the night to do stretches that were supposed to prevent my spine from elongating while I slept. He bought special shoes with compressed soles that made me walk like I was sinking into mud. When none of that worked, he hired a chiropractor who claimed he could manipulate my spine to stop growth through aggressive adjustments 3 times a week. I'd leave those appointments barely able to walk while Dad cheerfully noted that I looked shorter already. He convinced Mom that tall women suffered from joint problems and early arthritis, so she supported his interventions even when I sobbed through the treatments. By 15, I was 5'6", and Dad was desperate. He found a doctor online who wasn't licensed in our state but promised results through extreme methods. This man put me in weighted vests that I had to wear 16 hours a day to compress my spine. The weight started at 20 pounds but increased every week until I could barely stand upright. He also prescribed a sleeping contraption that looked like a medieval torture device, which compressed my body horizontally while I slept. I'd wake up gasping for air with my ribs feeling crushed, but Dad would just check the measurements and declare it was working. He pulled me out of sports and made me quit dancing because physical activity might stretch me out. Instead, I spent hours doing compression exercises while he lectured about the dating statistics for tall women. I started hiding my real height by constantly bending my knees and slouching, which destroyed my posture but kept Dad calm. At school, I'd sneak into the bathroom to stretch for a few minutes between classes, just to relieve the pain. Teachers noticed me wincing when I sat down and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't explain that my father was slowly compressing me like a human accordion. Then I met Oliver at a school event where I was practically crouching to hide my height. He was shorter than me but didn't care at all, which blew my mind after years of Dad's indoctrination. When I told him about the weighted vests and compression treatments, he looked horrified and said that wasn't normal. For the first time, I realized other girls my height weren't being medically tortured by their fathers. Oliver and I started dating secretly, and he'd massage my compressed spine after school while I practiced standing normally. His mom was 5'10" and had been happily married for 20 years, which shattered Dad's entire belief system. I felt like a real person for the first time in years instead of a defective product that needed fixing. But Dad found out when he followed me to Oliver's house and saw me standing at my full height through the window. He burst inside screaming that Oliver was sabotaging my future and destroying my marriageability. When Oliver called him insane, Dad grabbed me and said, "You want to be a freak? Fine, but I'm not letting you throw your life away." He dragged me home and showed me the appointment he'd made with a surgeon who specialized in leg shortening procedures. The doctor could remove sections of bone from my legs to permanently reduce my height by up to 4 inches. Dad had already paid the deposit and scheduled it for next month. He pulled out a saw from his toolbox and held it up to the light. "But if that doesn't work, princess, Daddy knows how to fix things himself." Grace grabbed her phone and dialed 911 while Dad stood there waving the saw around like it was totally normal. She told the operator there was a man threatening a child with a saw and we needed help right away. Dad kept going on about how women over 5'4" had a 30% higher chance of dying alone. The operator said units were on the way and to stay on the line, but Dad didn't even notice Grace was calling anyone. He pulled out another chart showing celebrity heights and divorce rates while I stood there shaking. Within 5 minutes, we heard sirens and Dad finally looked confused about what was happening. 2 police officers came through the door that Grace had left open and saw Dad still holding the saw. One officer moved toward Dad while telling him to put the weapon down, and the other came straight to me. Dad started explaining that this was about protecting my future and tried to show the officers his height charts. The officer with me asked if I was hurt, while the other one took the saw from Dad's hands. Dad insisted he was helping me avoid a lifetime of misery and pulled out his phone to show divorce statistics. Mom's car screeched into the driveway and she ran inside screaming about why police were in her house. She saw Dad with the officers and started yelling that they were interfering with medical treatment for my condition. The officer asked what condition, and Mom said I had excessive height disorder that required compression therapy. She actually pulled out her nursing license like that would make the police leave us alone. More sirens arrived and paramedics came in with their equipment while Dad kept trying to explain his theories. They had me sit down and started checking my spine while asking about the pain levels. I couldn't straighten my back all the way, and they saw the deep red marks on my shoulders from the weighted vest. The lead paramedic took photos of every bruise and mark while Oliver held my hand. She looked at the officers and said this was one of the worst cases of medical abuse she'd seen. Dad heard that and started shouting that they didn't understand the science behind height and happiness. A woman from Child Protective Services arrived and introduced herself while Dad got more upset. She said I was being placed in emergency protective custody for my safety, and Dad completely lost it. He screamed that the state was ruining my chances at happiness and destroying my marriageability. Mom tried to show the CPS worker her nursing credentials and explained that she supervised all treatments. The CPS worker just looked at the bruises on my shoulders and said that wasn't medical care. Grace stepped forward and offered to be my temporary guardian since Oliver and I were already close. The CPS worker said they'd discuss that after I got medical attention at the hospital. They loaded me into the ambulance while Dad shouted statistics about tall women's suicide rates from the driveway. 3 hours later at the hospital, they took me for x-rays of my whole spine and skeleton. The radiologist kept making worried sounds as she looked at the images on her computer screen. She showed me 3 vertebrae that had compression fractures from all all the weight I'd been carrying. My growth plates showed stress damage that she said came from the constant pressure on my bones. The medical staff started filling out mandatory reporting forms about child abuse while I waited. In the hospital room later, Grace helped me try to stand up completely straight for the first time in 2 years. My muscles shook and tears ran down my face from both the pain and the relief of it. Grace sat next to me and told me how kids made fun of her height in school, but she found love anyway. She said my father's theories weren't science, but just abuse dressed up with charts and graphs. Detective Sarah Wilson from the Crimes Against Children unit came to interview me the next day. A child advocate sat with us while the detective recorded everything I told her about the treatments. I showed her photos Oliver had secretly taken of the bruises from the weighted vests over the past months. She asked for the name of the unlicensed doctor, and I told her it was Dr. Nathan Kozlov. The detective wrote everything down and said they'd be investigating him along with my parents. The next morning, Grace brought me clothes from the store that actually fit my real height. Oliver came before school and we walked in the hospital garden where I practiced standing upright. My muscles trembled from years of forced hunching, but Oliver said I looked beautiful at my real height. He told me his whole family wanted to help and that his dad was a lawyer who could help with the legal stuff. At the CPS office later, they explained that the emergency custody hearing was scheduled for tomorrow. Dad's height charts meet reality when the cops show up, and suddenly his saw-based problem solving doesn't seem quite as scientific as those divorce statistics he keeps waving around. The social worker said Dad had already hired an attorney claiming this was just a parenting philosophy difference. Mom had aligned with Dad and filed a statement that she supervised all treatments as a medical professional. The social worker recommended I stay with the Martinez family based on their home evaluation. Grace took me to get my things from home with a police escort the next day. Dad had covered every single wall with new printouts about tall women's suicide rates and career failures. Mom stood in my room crying and said they only wanted me to be happy while pointing at all the statistics. I grabbed my clothes and school stuff while trying not to look at the compression equipment still in the corner. The officer started opening Dad's desk drawers while Grace helped me pack more clothes. He pulled out 3 thick binders labeled with my name and birth year. Inside were pages and pages of measurements written in Dad's tiny handwriting. Every single day for 3 years had an entry with my morning height, evening height, food intake, and compression session notes. The officer's eyes got wider as he flipped through them. Dad had tracked everything, including when my period started, and how he increased the compression weights that week because puberty might make me shoot up faster. There were charts showing optimal calorie amounts to slow growth without causing obvious malnutrition. He'd calculated exactly how many hours of sleep deprivation would stunt growth while still letting me function at school. The officer started taking photos of every page while calling for backup to collect more evidence. Grace found more binders in the closet with printed studies Dad had highlighted about height and marriage statistics. The compression device was still attached to my bed frame with leather straps and metal bars that looked like something from a horror movie. The officer measured it and took photos from every angle while writing notes about the rust stains on the straps. That night at Grace's house, I couldn't fall asleep in the normal bed. My body kept expecting the crushing pressure that had been there every night for years. I tried lying on the floor, but it wasn't the same. Grace found me at 2 in the morning crying and trying to stack books on my chest to recreate the weight. She sat with me on the floor and taught me breathing exercises while rubbing my back. She said my body would need time to adjust to sleeping normally again. The next morning, we went to the courthouse for the emergency custody hearing. Dad showed up with 2 briefcases full of papers that he spread across the table. He had hundreds of pages of graphs showing divorce rates for women over 5'4". He pulled out dating app data and celebrity marriage statistics while explaining to Judge Foster that he was protecting me from future heartbreak. Mom sat next to him nodding and told the judge that as a nurse, she monitored everything for my safety. She said Dad's methods were unconventional, but based on real research. Judge Foster looked through the medical reports from the hospital. The doctor had found compression fractures in my spine and signs of stunted growth from malnutrition. A specialist testified that I'd permanently lost about 2 inches of height from the years of compression. The chiropractor Dad hired admitted he wasn't licensed to work on kids and had been following Dad's instructions rather than medical guidelines. When Judge Foster mentioned possible criminal charges, Dad jumped up and started yelling. He screamed that the court was condemning me to be alone forever. He pulled out his phone showing dating profiles where men said they wouldn't date tall women. Security had to grab him when he lunged toward the judge's bench, still shouting that he was the only one who truly loved me and understood what I needed. Mom started crying and reached for his hand even as the guards dragged him out. Judge Foster ordered Dad to stay 500 feet away from me while the criminal investigation continued. She gave temporary custody to the Martinez family with supervised visits for Mom only. Mom turned to me with tears running down her face and said Dad knew what was best, and I'd thank them when I was older and alone. She chose him over me right there in the courtroom. 3 days later, I went back to school walking at my real height for the first time. Kids stared at me like I was a different person. Teachers who'd noticed me wincing in pain before came up asking if I was okay now. The school nurse had me come to her office to review my medical accommodations. I needed a special chair for my back and permission to stand up and walk around during long classes. She scheduled physical therapy twice a week during study hall. At lunch, Oliver and I sat together, and for the first time, I was taller than him by 3 inches. He made jokes about needing a ladder to kiss me, which actually made me laugh. His friends sat with us and formed this protective circle after hearing what happened. One girl who was 5'9" told me she'd been married for 3 years to a guy who loved that she could reach high shelves. A week later, Detective Wilson called us to the police station. They'd found Dr. Kozlov operating from a strip mall with no medical license. He was treating 12 other girls whose parents wanted them to stay short. His whole clinic was just a back room with the compression devices he'd been building himself. Police were contacting all the families to build cases. Dad had been his most extreme client and had paid him thousands in cash. Grace helped me fill out paperwork for victim compensation to cover the medical bills. The spine specialist said I'd need 2 years of treatment to partially fix the damage. Some of the compression was permanent and I should have been 5'8", but would probably stay at 5'6" forever. The first physical therapy session started a week later, and the therapist's face went white when she examined my spine. She ran her fingers along the curve that shouldn't exist in someone my age and asked me to stretch my arms above my head, which sent shooting pain down my back. Every basic movement hurt, and she kept writing notes while shaking her head and saying she'd never seen this kind of damage in a teenager. The exercises she gave me were meant for elderly patients with arthritis, but even those made me cry from pain. She had me lie on a mat and try to straighten my legs completely, which was impossible because my hamstrings had shortened from months of forced crouching. My hip flexors were so tight that standing straight felt like someone was ripping me apart at the waist. She worked on my shoulders, which had rolled forward permanently, and warned that fixing this would take years if it was even possible. That same week, Mom's lawyer sent a thick envelope to Grace's house with a letter saying Mom wanted to reconcile reconcile, but only if I acknowledged that Dad had good intentions and was trying to protect me. She'd included printed articles about forgiveness with yellow highlighter marking passages, about understanding that parents show love in different ways. There were testimonials from kids who'd forgiven their parents for worse things and gone on to have healthy relationships. Grace helped me write back that I'd consider contact only after the criminal case was resolved and only with a therapist present, and absolutely no discussion of my height or Dad's theories. Mom's lawyer responded within days saying those terms were unacceptable and that I was being manipulated by people who didn't understand our family dynamics. Oliver's dad, James, invited me to dinner at their house to discuss the legal situation and explained over pasta that the prosecutor was charging Dad with aggravated child abuse, conspiracy with Dr. Kozlov, and facilitating unlicensed medical practice. He'd reviewed the evidence and said Dad could face 15 years if convicted on all counts. The conspiracy charge was the strongest because they had bank records showing $30,000 in payments to Kozlov over 3 years. James was gentle but honest about how serious this was and offered to help pro bono with any civil suits I might want to file later. That night at Grace's house, I woke up at 2 in the morning and found myself standing hunched over without realizing it. My body had automatically made itself smaller even in sleep, and when I tried to stand straight, it felt wrong and dangerous, like I was breaking a rule. Grace found me in the bathroom at 3 a.m. with a measuring tape pressed against the wall, checking my height over and over, convinced I was still growing. She held me while I sobbed about how I couldn't stop hunching, and my body didn't know how to exist at its real size anymore. 2 weeks later, the school counselor called me in because teachers had reported I was still hunching in every class despite the special chair and desk accommodations they'd arranged. She documented everything with photos for the criminal case and told me 3 other girls at school had come forward with stories about their parents trying to control their height, though none involved medical torture. One girl's mom had made her wear ankle weights, another's dad had forbidden her from playing basketball, and the third had been put on a starvation diet at 12 to stunt her growth. The counselor was building a file to show this was part of a larger pattern of abuse that people didn't recognize. Dad's arraignment happened the next month at the courthouse downtown, and I had to watch from a separate room on a video screen because the prosecutor didn't want him to intimidate me. He pleaded not guilty while his lawyer argued this was a case of parental rights and alternative medicine choices that shouldn't be criminalized. The prosecutor presented evidence that Dad had paid Dr. Kozlov $30,000 for treatments that included spinal compression, weighted vests, and hormone blockers never approved for height suppression. Police photos of medieval torture devices disguised as medical equipment, while Dad's binders reveal 3 years of height obsession journals. Someone watched too many mad scientist movies and thought, yes, this seems perfectly reasonable for parenting. She showed the court photos of the torture device Dad had built for my bed and the collection of saws he'd gathered when threatening DIY surgery. Mom sat directly behind Dad, holding his hand and glaring at the camera she knew I was watching through. The judge set bail at $50,000 with conditions including no contact with me, no contact with any minors, and surrender of his passport. Dad's lawyer argued he wasn't a flight risk, just a concerned father who'd used alternative medicine, but the judge said the saw threats elevated this beyond medical disagreement into potential violence. 3 days later, Detective Wilson came to Grace's house with news that made me sick. Dr. Kozlov had kept video recordings of every treatment session showing me screaming and begging to stop while Dad insisted I continue and held me down. The footage was evidence, but it also meant strangers would watch my torture in court, and I had to decide whether to allow its use. Detective Wilson said it would strengthen the case significantly, but understood if I couldn't handle people seeing me that vulnerable. I sat there shaking while she explained that 12 hours of footage existed showing the escalation from basic compression to extreme torture over 3 years. Grace took me shopping the next day to find clothes that actually fit my real body instead of the baggy things I'd been hiding in. In the dressing room, I completely broke down seeing myself at full height in the 3-way mirror because every outfit looked wrong on my frame that Dad had convinced me was too tall. Nothing felt right, and I kept automatically hunching to make myself smaller in every reflection. Grace reminded me that Dad's voice telling me I was too tall wasn't the truth, but it was so deep in my head I couldn't shut it off. Oliver organized a dinner the following week with 3 tall girls from school who wanted to support me. Sarah was 6'1" and played basketball with colleges already recruiting her. Emma was 5'10" and showing off her engagement ring from her boyfriend, who was 5'8". Melissa was 5'11" and had just gotten into medical school. They shared stories about loving their height and how they'd never had trouble dating or being happy. Sarah said her boyfriend was 5'9" and loved that she could reach high shelves. Emma's fiance had fallen for her at a dance where she was taller than him in heels. They showed me pictures from prom and homecoming, where they stood proud at their full height with shorter dates who didn't care at all. I realized Dad had cherry-picked his statistics and ignored millions of happy tall women living normal lives. The next week, CPS called us into their office where the social worker sat behind a desk covered with papers and told us Mom had filed for custody. She pushed a stack of documents across the table showing Mom's nursing license and a letter from a therapist saying she'd been under Dad's control and couldn't stop him. The social worker tapped her pen on the desk and said they had to investigate even though she didn't look convinced. Grace squeezed my hand while the social worker explained Mom claimed she could take care of me properly now that Dad was gone. 2 days later, I was leaving physical therapy when Mom appeared in the parking lot and grabbed my arm. She begged me to come home and tell everyone Dad forced her to go along with his ideas. When I tried to pull away, she said the theory wasn't wrong and I was destroying our family over a few inches. She grabbed my shoulders and tried to push me down to make me shorter while I struggled to get free. My physical therapist ran outside when she heard me yelling and called security while Mom kept saying I needed to stop being selfish. The security guards had to pull her off me and she screamed that she was my mother as they dragged her away. A month later, we sat in court for the restraining order hearing where the judge watched the security footage from the therapy center. Mom's lawyer stood up and said it was just maternal concern and she was trying to help me with my posture. The judge shook her head and extended the protection order to include Mom after noting she still believed I needed to be shorter. That afternoon, I started seeing Dr. Patricia Huang, who specialized in kids whose parents hurt them for medical reasons. She had a small office with plants everywhere and explained that Dad had created a cult in our house where his theories became our reality. She said I wasn't just healing my body, but deprogramming from years of being told I was too tall. At night in my room at Grace's house, I'd wake up feeling the weighted vest crushing my shoulders even though it wasn't there. Sometimes I'd gasp awake thinking the compression device was squeezing my ribs, and Grace would have to come in and remind me I was safe. She'd sit on my bed and tell me no one was making me smaller anymore while I tried to catch my breath. 2 weeks later, Detective Wilson called us to her office and pulled out a thick folder. She said they'd interviewed Dr. Kozlov's other patients and found 3 families pressing charges. One girl who was 18 now had started treatment when she was 10 and her spine never grew right. The detective showed us medical reports saying the girl would never stand up straight and would need surgery for the rest rest of her life. My stomach dropped when she said there were probably more victims they hadn't found yet. The next morning at school, the office called me down because a package had arrived for me. Inside were ankle weights and a note in Dad's handwriting saying they were for when I realized he was right. The principal checked the security cameras and saw Dad in the parking lot at dawn dropping off the box. Police arrested him at his motel room where they found the walls covered with new articles about height and dating statistics. At his bail hearing, the judge revoked his bail for violating the restraining order. Dad stood up and started lecturing the judge about the epidemic of unmarriageable tall women, while his own lawyer asked for a psychiatric evaluation. Mom sat in the back row watching, and for the first time she looked worried about his behavior instead of nodding along. That weekend, Oliver's family officially became my foster placement, and we spent the day fixing up the guest room. We painted sunflowers on the walls because Grace said they grow tall and proud without apology. She helped me hang mirrors at my actual height so I could finally see myself properly. The room had high shelves I could reach without stretching, and a bed that fit my real body instead of the compressed version Dad wanted. At dinner that night, Oliver's little sister asked why my parents hurt me when parents are supposed to protect kids. Grace put down her fork and explained that sometimes parents' love gets twisted by their own fears until protection becomes a prison. She said my parents thought they were helping but couldn't see they were hurting me instead. I looked around the table at this family who accepted my height and realized this was what I should have had all along. 3 weeks passed before Detective Wilson called with news that made my stomach drop. Dr. Kozlov had been arrested in Arizona, running the exact same height suppression scheme on 3 other teenage girls whose parents found him through online forums where people discussed managing their children's development. She said investigators discovered dozens of these forums with thousands of parents sharing tips about compression techniques and unlicensed doctors who would perform dangerous procedures without asking questions. Dad wasn't some unique monster, but part of an entire underground network of parents who believed they could engineer their children's bodies to match their twisted ideals. The prosecutor assigned to our case met with us the next day in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and explained they were charging Dad with aggravated child abuse, conspiracy, and terroristic threats for the Saw incident. If convicted, he faced 15 to 20 years in prison, which seemed both too long and not nearly enough for what he'd done to my body. They offered Mom a plea deal to testify against him in exchange for probation, but she refused immediately and said she would stand by her husband because his intentions were good, even if his methods were extreme. The medical evaluation for trial evidence took 6 hours at the county hospital, where they ran every test imaginable on my compressed spine. The MRI showed permanent disc damage between 3 vertebrae, early onset arthritis in my lower back, and nerve compression that would likely require surgery before I turned 30. The specialist looked at the images and shook his head while explaining that Dad hadn't just stolen inches from my height, but decades from my health, since I'd be dealing with chronic pain and mobility issues for the rest of my life. Oliver took me to winter formal 2 weeks later, and for the first time in years, I wore heels that made me stand 5'9" in photos. Dad would have been horrified seeing me tower over half the boys there, but Oliver just smiled proudly and said I looked perfect at any height, which was exactly what I needed to hear after years of being told I was too much. My phone rang during the dance, and Mom's sister Catherine was on the other end crying and apologizing for not intervening when she suspected something was wrong. She admitted Dad had done the same thing to Mom when they first met, convincing her that her 5'5" height made her barely acceptable, and she was lucky he wanted to marry someone so tall. The pattern went deeper than I'd realized, and suddenly Mom's compliance made more sense if she'd been programmed from the beginning to believe Dad's theories about women's bodies. Pre-trial hearings started a month later in a courtroom packed with reporters who'd caught wind of the height suppression case. Pre-trial hearings with packed reporters discovering the height suppression case, Dad's twisted theories just became front-page news where everyone can see his ridiculous ruler-based reality show. Dad's lawyer argued for an insanity defense and presented thousands of pages of his research as evidence of delusion, including charts correlating female height with divorce rates and happiness scores he'd compiled from dating websites. The prosecutor countered that the meticulous planning and use of unlicensed doctors showed Dad knew what he was doing was wrong, which is why he kept it secret and threatened me when I tried to resist. Mom took the stand for the defense, claiming Dad's theories made sense given society's preferences for petite women, and she'd only been trying to help by monitoring my treatments for safety. Under cross-examination, she broke down and admitted she never reported the compression fractures visible on my x-rays from 2 years ago, even though as a nurse she knew they indicated abuse. The judge ruled Dad competent to stand trial after the psychiatric evaluation showed personality disorder, but not legal insanity, since he understood the consequences of his actions, but believed his ideology superseded the law. The trial date was set for 3 months out, and Mom was banned from contacting me during the proceedings, which felt like losing her all over again, even though she'd chosen Dad over my safety. I joined the volleyball team at school once my back healed enough to play, and for the first time my height was actually an advantage instead of something to hide. My teammates cheered when I spiked the ball over the net using my full reach, even though my spine still ached from the years of compression. During therapy 2 weeks later, Patricia pointed out I was unconsciously checking height preferences on dating apps, trying to find evidence that Dad was wrong about tall women being undesirable. She helped me realize I was still seeking validation for something I already knew was a lie, since my happiness had nothing to do with inches and everything to do with being allowed to exist in my natural body without shame or compression devices. Detective Miller called me the next day with news that made my stomach drop. She'd spent weeks digging through Dad's computer and found forums where he'd been posting for years about controlling female development. The screenshots she sent showed hundreds of posts where Dad shared his compression techniques with other fathers who wanted to keep their daughters small. He'd uploaded charts showing optimal vest weights for different ages, and detailed guides about which chiropractors would perform aggressive adjustments without asking questions. Some users called him a pioneer and asked for private consultations about their own daughters. The prosecutor added cyberstalking charges when they found spreadsheets where Dad tracked my measurements alongside data from girls at my school whose heights he'd somehow obtained. Oliver's family started getting letters 2 days later that Grace found stuffed in their mailbox at dawn. The first one called them enablers of female defects and warned them about harboring a future spinster who would die alone. More letters arrived daily with increasingly violent language about what happens to families who interfere with proper parenting. The handwriting expert confirmed it wasn't Dad since he was still in jail, but someone had clearly been inspired by his online posts. Police started driving past Oliver's house every few hours after one letter included photos of their front door. 3 weeks later, the depositions began in a sterile conference room downtown. I sat across from a court reporter who typed every word while I described described the weighted vests that started at 20 pounds and increased weekly until I could barely stand. Dad watched through a video screen from jail and kept shouting that I was getting the dates wrong, even though I had photos showing the exact timeline. His lawyer had to mute him repeatedly when he started yelling about how the spine compression device was actually helping my posture. The prosecutor made me go through each treatment in detail, while Dad's face got redder on the screen. Spring arrived, and with it came the growth spurt I'd been dreading even with Dad locked up. I woke up one morning and knew instantly that I'd gained height because my pajama pants were shorter. The measuring tape confirmed another half-inch, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly. Grace found me at 2 in the morning trying to compress my spine with textbooks stacked on my back because my body still believed growing meant danger. She sat with me on the bathroom floor while I shook and explained that the fear lived in my muscles now. Oliver's dad James visited the next week to explain victim impact statements and how I'd get to address the court about what Dad had done. He helped me draft pages of notes about the chronic pain and the way I still caught myself hunching even though no one was measuring me anymore. We tried to find words for what it felt like to be slowly crushed for years, but everything sounded too small for the reality. James said the jury needed to understand that Dad hadn't just hurt my body, but had made me afraid of existing in it. Jury selection started on a humid Monday at the courthouse where potential jurors filed in looking confused about why they were there. Dad's lawyer immediately challenged every woman over 5'6", claiming they'd be biased against his client's theories. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed several tall women to be dismissed, which made Dad grin from his seat at the defense table. Mom attended every day with a notebook where she wrote down each juror's approximate height like she was still collecting data for Dad's research. Trial day 1 brought opening statements that made everything real in a way that depositions hadn't. The prosecutor stood up and told the jury they'd hear about systematic torture disguised as parenting while showing blown-up photos of my compressed spine from medical exams. She passed around the weighted vests and let jurors feel how heavy 20 pounds was for a 14-year-old to wear 16 hours daily. Dad's lawyer argued that my father was misguided but loving and only wanted to protect me from discrimination that tall women face in society. He claimed Dad's methods came from genuine concern, even if they were extreme. When my turn came to testify, I sat in the witness chair for 6 straight hours, describing years of compression treatments and sleepless nights doing stretches to prevent growth. The defense lawyer kept asking if Dad ever hit me, and when I said no, he suggested the abuse wasn't real if there were no bruises. I told him Dad crushed me slowly instead of quickly, and asked which was worse, but he just moved on to his next question. During cross-examination, he pulled out Dad's statistics and asked if I knew the divorce rate for women over 5'8". The prosecutor objected immediately, but several jurors looked thoughtful, like they were actually considering the data might be relevant. Mom nodded from the gallery as if the statistics proved everything Dad had done was justified. Dr. Kozlov appeared on a video screen from federal prison where he was being held for practicing without a license. He admitted Dad was his most dedicated client and that he knew the compression treatments were causing damage to my spine and ribs. He claimed Dad threatened to report him to authorities if he refused to increase the weight of the vests, which made both men point fingers at each other through their respective screens. The judge called Oliver to the stand next, and my stomach twisted into knots watching him walk up there in his best shirt that his mom had ironed 3 times that morning. His hands shook as he raised them for the oath, and I could see the prosecutor giving him an encouraging nod before starting with easy questions about how we met. Oliver described finding me hunched over behind the gym, crying from the pain of the weighted vest, and how he'd helped me take it off for just a few minutes of relief. His voice cracked when he told them about the bruises across my ribs and shoulders from where the straps dug in, and how I'd begged him not to tell anyone. The prosecutor asked about the saw, and Oliver went quiet for a moment before describing how Dad had held it up during dinner while explaining his backup plan if the surgery didn't work. Dad jumped up from his seat yelling that Oliver was just another short man intimidated by female height, and the judge banged her gavel warning him about contempt charges. During the lunch recess, I wandered down the hall to use the bathroom and past other courtrooms where normal families were dealing with normal problems. Through one open door, I saw a dad helping his tall teenage daughter fill out paperwork for her basketball scholarship while she bounced excitedly in her seat. The sight of him proudly measuring her height on the form while she grinned made something crack inside me, and I ran to the bathroom where Grace found me sobbing against the sink. She held me while I shook and kept repeating that it wasn't fair, and she just rubbed my back saying she knew, baby, she knew. After lunch, Mom took the stand wearing her best nurse scrubs like she was going to work instead of defending child abuse in court. The prosecutor showed her my x-rays on the big screen and pointed to the compression fractures in my spine, while Mom sat there calmly explaining she'd been monitoring everything for safety. She insisted that some discomfort was expected for results, and that she'd given me pain medication when needed, as if drugging your kid to endure torture was normal parenting. One of the jurors actually leaned back in her chair with her hand over her mouth while Mom kept talking about acceptable risk levels and long-term benefits. Mom seemed completely unaware of the horror on everyone's faces, as she explained how she'd measured my spine curvature weekly to track the compression progress. The medical experts came next with their laptops and charts showing the permanent damage to my body in clinical detail that made it real in a way Dad's theories never could. Mom switching between taking notes on juror heights and defending medical torture in her nurse scrubs really takes professional development to new criminal levels that nursing school definitely didn't cover in their ethics classes. They explained I had early onset arthritis at 16 and would likely need spinal fusion surgery before I turned 40 because of the compression damage. The worst part was when they said I'd never reach my genetic height of 5'8" because the compression during my crucial growth years had stolen those inches forever. My body had adapted to being crushed, and now even without the vests, I'd never stand as tall as I was meant to be. On day 5, Dad's character witnesses testified via video link from various basements and home offices around the country. These men from his online forums praised his courage in protecting me from heightism, and one claimed his own daughter thanked him daily for similar treatments. The prosecutor pulled up court records showing that same daughter had filed a restraining order against him 6 months ago. Another witness ranted about the feminist agenda promoting female height until the judge cut his feed and Dad actually applauded from the defense table. Finally, Dad took the stand himself, wheeling in 3 suitcases full of his charts and graphs, like he was giving a conference presentation instead of defending himself in court. He set up his laptop and projector and literally gave the jury a 2-hour lecture complete with PowerPoint slides about female height and happiness correlations. He showed dating site data where he'd tracked thousands of women's heights against their match rates and relationship lengths. He pulled up celebrity divorce statistics organized by height and suicide rates for women over 5'10" that he'd compiled from news articles. Not once did he look at me or show any sign he understood understood why everyone was staring at him in horror. He called himself a pioneer in preventive parenting and said future generations would thank him for his research into optimal female proportions. Under cross-examination, things got even worse as Dad admitted he'd never consulted real doctors because they were all part of the system promoting female growth. He said the saw threat was just hyperbole born from love, and when the prosecutor showed him my x-rays with the fractures, he said they were worth preventing a lifetime of rejection. Grace testified next as my foster mother and described finding me curled up in the closet my first night because beds felt too exposed after months of compression devices. She told them about my night terrors where I'd wake up gasping and clutching at invisible vests around my chest. She explained how I apologized constantly for taking up space and tried to make myself smaller by hunching even when standing hurt less. During the second week of trial, I was eating lunch alone in the courthouse cafeteria when a tall woman approached my table. She whispered that she was an alternate juror and shouldn't be talking to me, but she was 6'1" and had been happily married for 30 years. She showed me photos of her 3 kids and her husband, who was 5'8" and clearly adored her before security noticed and escorted her away. She got dismissed for talking to me, but her words stuck in my head, especially when Dad's defense expert took the stand that afternoon. This psychologist claimed Dad suffered from something called parental projection disorder, which sounded made up because it was, and tried to explain Dad's behavior as misguided love. He said Dad's own romantic failures after his divorce created a pathological fear for my future that manifested in extreme prevention methods. The prosecutor's expert got up next and said that was complete nonsense, and this was just narcissistic abuse dressed up with pseudo-scientific justification. The judge called for closing arguments the next morning, and the prosecutor stood up with a stack of papers that she spread across a table like a timeline of my life getting worse. She pointed to each piece of evidence, starting with the vitamin throwing and moving through the weighted vests, and ending with the saw photo from Dad's toolbox. She held up the x-rays showing my compressed spine and the chiropractor's notes about aggressive adjustments 3 times a week. The jury stared at the progression laid out in front of them, while she explained how Dad didn't just hurt me once, but systematically tortured me for years with increasing intensity. She showed them the sleep deprivation log and the compression device photos, and said he treated me like a science experiment instead of a daughter. The defense attorney got up next and started talking about how society pressures women to be small, and Dad was just trying to protect me from discrimination. He pulled out dating app statistics and workplace studies showing tall women face real challenges, and said Dad went too far, but his intentions came from love, not malice. He asked the jury if they could really convict a father for wanting his daughter to avoid pain, even if his methods were wrong. The jury left to deliberate, and I sat in the hallway feeling my body automatically hunching like it had been trained to do for years. Oliver kept reminding me to sit up straight, but my spine curved forward on its own because standing tall meant punishment in my muscle memory. Every hour dragged by while we waited, and I caught myself checking the clock constantly hoping for news. The first day ended with no verdict, and we went home to wait some more while my stomach churned with anxiety. The second morning, Mom found me during a recess and said she was planning to leave Dad if he got convicted because she finally understood they went too far. But then she started explaining how the height statistics were still accurate and tall women really do face discrimination. So the theory wasn't completely wrong, just the execution. I realized she hadn't actually learned anything and still believed Dad's charts were based on real science instead of his obsession. The jury sent a note that afternoon asking to review all of Dad's charts and the medical evidence again, which made the prosecutor nervous. She worried that someone on the jury might be buying the protective father story and thinking Dad was just misguided instead of abusive. That night, Oliver's family held a vigil at their house, and his little sister gave me a card with a sunflower that said, "Tall and proud," which made me cry. His mom's friend James, who was handling the civil case, explained that criminal court would decide guilt, but civil court would make Dad pay for all the damage he caused. The third morning, the jury finally came back, and when they read guilty on all counts, Dad jumped up screaming about bias against fathers who just want to protect their daughters. The bailiffs had to drag him out while he yelled about corrupt judges, and how I'd regret this when I was 40 and alone. Mom collapsed in her seat sobbing about the injustice of convicting a loving father, while I just felt empty and relieved at the same time. A month later, we were back for sentencing, and I had to read my victim impact statement with my voice shaking the whole time. I told the judge how Dad stole inches I'll never get back, and made me afraid of my own body, and convinced me that existing at my natural height was wrong. I explained that what he called love was really control through torture, and I'd spend years trying to undo the damage he caused. Dad got his turn to speak and immediately pulled out new charts showing how my future prospects had declined since his arrest according to his calculations. He claimed I'd die alone and childless because I refused his help, and the judge had to cut him off when he started ranting about female height correlations. The judge noted his complete lack of remorse and sentenced him to 18 years with possible parole in 12 plus. He had to register as a child abuser and pay all my medical costs. As the officers dragged him away, he was still shouting that I'd thank him when I was 40 and alone and quoting statistics about unmarried tall women. The courtroom doors hadn't even closed behind him when Mom pushed through the crowd toward me with papers clutched in her hand. She grabbed my arm and pulled me aside while everyone was still processing what just happened. Her face looked different without Dad around. Softer maybe, but her eyes still had that calculating look I'd learned to fear. She shoved divorce papers at me and said she wanted to rebuild our relationship now that Dad was gone, but then added, "I would have been happier at 5'4". The words hit me like a slap, and I realized she'd never change, never stop believing his theories even after everything. Grace stepped between us immediately and told Mom I was perfect at any height before steering me away from her toxic presence. 2 weeks later, I sat in another doctor's office, this time with a real spine specialist who gasped when he saw my x-rays. He ran his finger along the screen showing me where the compression had damaged nerves and created bone spurs that would need surgical removal. The surgery could happen in summer and might give me back an inch of height, but I'd never reach my natural 5'8". It was something though, more hope than I'd had in years of being crushed and compressed. Dr. Kozlov's federal trial happened faster than expected, and he stood in court pleading guilty to everything they charged him with. He got 8 years federal time and named Dad as the architect of the entire compression protocol, which made the prosecutor's eyes widen. The worst part came when he revealed Dad had been developing a manual to sell to other parents who wanted to control their daughter's heights. Spring arrived, and Oliver convinced me to go dress shopping for the formal, even though the thought made my stomach clench. In the store, I automatically reached for flats and loose dresses that would hide my body like I'd been trained to do. The saleswoman suggested heels, heels, and I actually started shaking until Oliver reminded me I was allowed to take up space now. Recovery wasn't just about fixing my spine. It was about unlearning years of making myself small in every way possible. Dad's PowerPoint presentation about optimal female proportions in criminal court might be the most creative defense strategy I've ever seen fail this badly. Nothing says I'm innocent quite like bringing 3 suitcases of height charts to explain why crushing your daughter's spine was actually smart parenting for the modern world. The civil trial started with Mom's lawyer arguing that marital assets shouldn't pay for parenting decisions, which made several jury members visibly angry. My lawyer presented Mom's own nursing notes where she'd documented my injuries without ever reporting them to authorities. The evidence showed she'd chosen Dad over my safety every single time there was a choice to make. The jury came back with a verdict of $2.3 million in damages against both my parents. The house would be sold, Dad's pension garnished, and Mom's nursing wages would be attached for years to pay the judgment. Mom screamed about being punished for supporting her husband, but the judge cut her off and noted she'd repeatedly chosen him over her daughter's safety. A month later, I stood at a podium in front of hundreds of doctors at a medical conference about recognizing hidden abuse. When I showed the compression device photos, the entire room gasped, and several doctors admitted they might have missed the warning signs. One doctor stood up and said we need to listen when children say they're in pain instead of dismissing them. Graduation day arrived, and I wore 3-inch heels that made me stand 5'9" again for the first time since Dad started crushing me. Oliver held my hand as we walked across the stage while Dad's mother sat in the audience crying and apologizing for not intervening. She'd known his height obsession was concerning but never said anything. Another adult who'd failed to protect me. The college acceptance letter came with a full scholarship for volleyball and academics, my height listed as an asset by the coach. I cried reading it because Dad had been wrong about everything. My height had opened doors instead of closing them. Oliver joked about visiting his tall girlfriend at university, which made me laugh for the first time in months. 6 months later, I lay on a surgical table while doctors worked for 7 hours to decompress my nerves and remove the bone spurs. Grace and Oliver waited with James and his sister, who'd become like family to me during the trial. Even Mom sent a card, though she couldn't resist mentioning she was dating someone who appreciated petite women. The surgery took longer than expected, but when I woke up, the surgeon told me they'd successfully decompressed all the damaged nerves, and I'd gained back 3/4 of an inch already. My spine would need a full year of physical therapy, but without this intervention, I would have been in a wheelchair by 35, according to the scans. 2 weeks later, I stood in Grace's kitchen for the first time without any pain in 5 years and measured myself against their wall at 5'6" and 3/4. Not the 5'8" I should have been naturally, but taller than Dad ever wanted me to be. Grace helped me mark the line with a smiley face instead of the grim measurements Dad used to record. The foster care review came right before I turned 18, and the judge asked if I wanted to make the placement official, even though I was aging out. Grace and James both started crying when I said yes, because even though I didn't need legal parents anymore, I wanted real ones. Oliver made jokes about us being siblings now, but we all knew it was different when you chose your family. A month later, Dad's lawyer forwarded a letter from prison that still included newspaper clippings about tall women's depression rates, which violated the no-contact order. I kept it as evidence, but didn't read past the first line because some people never change their delusions no matter what happens. My freshman year of college started with me joining the volleyball team, where my roommate was 6'2" and engaged to her high school sweetheart. We'd study together and laugh about my dad's theories while I learned to tell the difference between actual spine pain and the ghost pains from years of compression. Oliver visited for Valentine's Day and took me to a dance where I wore 4-inch heels that made me tower over him. He spun me around the floor proud and happy, while other couples watched us with admiration instead of judgment. We were living proof that love didn't need anyone to shrink themselves. Mom reached out that spring saying Dad wanted me to visit him in prison because he'd reformed and wanted to apologize. She'd remarried someone who appreciated all heights but still visited Dad monthly, and swore he'd changed even though he still kept height charts taped to his cell wall. I declined because some apologies aren't worth hearing when the person hasn't actually changed. My college therapist helped me recognize that I still hunched unconsciously in crowds, and we worked on taking up space without apologizing for existing. She reminded me during every session that my height wasn't a defect to manage, but just my body deserving of respect. Our team won the regional championship at the end of freshman year, and the local paper ran a feature about our tall squad with pride. My name appeared next to my official height of 5'7" since I'd grown another 1/4 inch during the year. Dad would have hated seeing it in print, but that made me smile every time I looked at the clipping. When I moved into my sophomore apartment, I hung all the mirrors at my actual eye level, which meant Oliver needed a stepladder to use them properly. Grace brought sunflowers as a housewarming gift that required looking up to admire, and I stood in my new space, finally at home in my own body. This height might not be perfect, and my spine might always ache a little, but it's mine, and that's exactly where I belong. They're hanging mirrors at eye level, and suddenly Oliver's reaching for a ladder? That's peak roommate sitcom energy. You can't make this stuff up. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.